It's spring 2025, which is important to name because depending on which side of the political spectrum you're on and which country you're from, you're either in total shock with the political upheaval and the acceptance of authoritarian rule in America, or you think everything is trending your way. Amidst waves of confusion is a simple truth. The current state in the United States wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the unwavering support from white evangelicals. So the question is, would society be better off if more people left evangelicalism? If you're on the fence about that, not sure where to land or what to say, this series will help as we offer tools and pathways to help more folks say, farewell, evangelicalism. Intro by Jesse Peters. Thanks, Jesse. All the bumper music, most all, is by Daniel Wheat. Check them both out. Welcome, friends. If we haven't been acquainted yet, my name is Rohadi. I'll introduce myself a little bit more shortly. The Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast is a podcast on deconstructing and decolonizing Christianity, and usually I would have guests come on and share about their books, sometimes share about a topic. But this is the first serial season, which means there's a narrative that holds every episode together, and that narrative is rooted in the question of saying farewell to evangelicalism. The idea is if we display, show, reveal all of the malformed pillars that are upholding evangelicalism, that more people might find it in themselves to leave. Now, perhaps that's you. Perhaps you know somebody in your family, in your community, folks who are still in the clutches of evangelicalism. We want to give the tools. And since, hey, it's a podcast and you can listen in the privacy of your own ear holes, maybe it's you. Oftentimes, when folks are stuck in cult-like communities, it takes some permission to affirm all of the cracks that you've been noticing that don't make sense and certainly don't line up with your Christian faith. The first question we want to ask is, who is this for? Certainly the Christian folks, the curious Christians, the lapsed Christians, those who grew up in Christianity. Now, as many of my friends and those before us have said, there's not one form of Christianity, although the Roman Catholic Church and many evangelicals would beg to differ. There's just a lot of Christianities, different expressions that are trying to figure out what it means to live like Jesus. Except what happens when your tradition ignores Jesus or takes Jesus and interprets Jesus through a white Republican blue-eyed surfer from California who's definitely anti-immigrant and pro-guns and against abortion and all the other pillars of Christianity today. They don't have a lot in common with Jesus, but they have a lot of power. And I think that's the allure. In this podcast, you will hear from not just my voice, but many experts in their field. There'll be two prongs. One will be the expert voice, but we also, if we're intentional about the decolonial lens, we're not just going to ask experts because another form of truth will be story. Your story counts. And so we'll hear from many folks who have processed through their deconstruction out of evangelicalism, how they did it, what they saw, what was the experience, and maybe give a couple of clues to folks who are trying to do the same. Receive this invitation to embark on your own deconstruction and ignore all of the social media influencers who are on the way far right, decrying, saying deconstruction's so bad because people just want to sin, which is the most vapid and empty answer designed to oppose and probably make people afraid of leaving their Christian faith, which, by the way, is a very valid concern because a lot of folks are enmeshed so deeply within their church community that if you leave, you lose your entire community. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's going to be the grief episode. So, who am I? I introduced myself as Rohadi. My pronouns are he, him. And I'm recording on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary in the province of Alberta in the country of Canada. And no, we will not become the 51st state. You will hear most of our guests introduce themselves in similar ways. Some will add their credentials, but most all will name the traditional Indigenous territories on which their feet touch. That's an important component, a very small one, in an effort to acknowledge the first peoples on the land. I am a writer. You can find my books in the show notes. I'm also a sometimes pastor. In church language, you would call me a church planter, and I've been figuring out what it means to live out the Christian faith in a very post-Christian context, which is most of Canada, on the edge of inside of most church traditions. But I also grew up in what I would now name as white evangelicalism for the first, say, 15 years of my life. Yet I've spent more time now outside of evangelicalism than I have within it. I did all of the church things like lead worship, preach. I even went to seminary after university. So I guess you could say I'm a bit of an expert when it comes to evangelicalism. Yes, I was in evangelical seminary. And even though I have all of those quote unquote leadership tendencies, if you're anything like me, then there were multiple moments in your spiritual experience where you said, wait a tick, something ain't right. Your body absorbed some type of malformed reality, whether it was patriarchy, racism, ableism. Well, I won't get ahead of myself. We'll talk about these pillars soon. But something in your body said no. And yeah, I know in evangelicalism, you're supposed to mistrust your body. The body shouldn't be trusted because it is spiritually profane and broken and decrepit and sinful and so forth, and all these weird things that evangelicals say in order to control bodies. But at some point within all of that mess, you have to make a decision of whether or not all of the weird is worth staying. Now, why would we choose evangelicals? Simply put, the most powerful Christian voting bloc in America, not named the Roman Catholic Church, is an expression of Christianity named evangelicalism. Now, regardless of where you are around the world, chances are evangelicalism has touched your shores. But it's the percentage of voting population that we're after here. In Canada, about 2/3 of the population, if they had to, would check the box of religious versus non-religious. Yet evangelicals are only about 5% of the total population. In America, there's a similar connection. About 2/3 of folks, if they had to, they would check the box religious. Yet, those who would claim to be evangelical are about 1 in every 4, or 25% of the population. That makes for a sizable voting bloc. Now, here's the problem. In 2016, white evangelicals as a whole, the tradition overwhelmingly supported the Republican presidential nominee, and we all know what happened after that. Now, fast forward 8 years, and all of the different weird from felony and rape convictions, character problems. What do you think happened to the evangelical vote? It actually didn't change one bit. That to me says two things. One, evangelicals as a whole are responsible for the reality we are in now. And the suggestion is, if enough folks leave evangelicalism, many of the problems that we are facing today would be eliminated. But here's the kicker. Earlier, I mentioned evangelicalism as an illegitimate expression. Yet, it doesn't really serve us to say that evangelicals aren't Christian. What I'm going to do is compare evangelical pillars, the important components that are a part of the tradition today, with the teachings of Jesus. We're going to see how they just don't line up. But it doesn't serve us to say that evangelicals aren't Christian. They would call themselves Christian. And the magnitude of harm that evangelicals have incurred, starting with bodies on the margins and working their way up, is so profound that we can't detract or say they're not Christian. We have to hold that tension and say, listen, they have done that in the name of Christianity. They are Christians by their own admission. So where do we go from here? My hope is that we move towards a reclamation, towards Jesus' call, where the oppressed are set free, where the last shall be first, and a radical ethic of love encompasses all of our characteristics and activities for material liberation in the here and now. Now, it's important for us to note that there's no central authority of evangelicalism. No one says you're in or out. There's no website you can look up and say, oh, these are evangelical churches that espouse the teachings of evangelicalism. There are no central teachings. There are themes. So if you're a theology nerd, you've heard of the Babington Quadrilateral. It includes 4 different components, which is Bible or devotion to the Bible. It includes centrality of the cross, activism, which is that justice component that, well, now evangelicals are afraid and allergic to justice, and then conversionism, which has been reduced to this one-line prayer to save your immaterial soul for eternity up into heaven. That's about it. So how is it possible then to motivate evangelicals around one central idea or belief? Since there are no central beliefs, yet evangelicals are easily motivated as a voting bloc around central issues, how do you do it? Well, you turn those wedge issues into central belief systems. Suddenly, the Bible, which reportedly was an evangelical pillar, is not as important as the political aspirations for social power. Mesh in political aspirations with fear. Oh, so much fear in evangelicalism. Fear against everything that is not matched to the white male gaze. And if you can add in a layer of fear of the possibility of a loss of a particular white way of life, suddenly you have motivation that's not related in any particular way to the Bible or to Jesus, but you do have enough to take a whole stack of voting believers and telling them where they should put their votes. That's how we wind up in 2025 and the calamity that is before us. Don't believe me? What was the evangelical and conservative Christian response to the final outro of this sermon 2 days after the inauguration?
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President. Millions have put their trust in you. And as you told the nation yesterday, you have felt the providential hand of a loving God. In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation. But the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen.
Whew. Days after the inauguration, the courageous words from the Right Reverend Dr. Mariann Budde. She spoke these words in service when the president had to go to a service, kind of like a petulant child being dragged to church by his mother. The courage to speak about mercy infuriated the president, which makes sense if you're a felon and a rapist. But the right-wing conservative evangelical Christian response to a sermon on mercy, embodying the teachings of Jesus, was met with so much vitriol, hate, violence. We expect their violence. They expect their violence. It serves as a final, not first, final clue that things are not okay in the evangelical house. One that seeks to embody malformed power and do whatever it takes to get it, regardless of who they have to throw under the bus and what beliefs they have to give up in the process. Any church tradition that seeks power to propagate their malformed beliefs rooted in the oppression of marginalized people first, to me, are illegitimate expressions of the Christian tradition. That is a substantial claim to make, which is why we are going to interrogate the main pillars of belief in evangelicalism. You will note how they don't line up to the teachings of Jesus, but they do line up to the pursuit of social power that centers a white, cisgendered, straight male gaze. Some of the pillars that we will interrogate include conspiracy theory, propaganda, patriarchy, the Bible, white supremacy, ableism, queer and trans folks, to name a few. The malformed pillars in evangelicalism and conservative Christian expressions actively bring harm for those outside of the church and for those within it. It's my hope that by exposing the malformed elements that are now in the DNA of evangelical thought and beliefs, that it will provide affirmation for folks to leave the abuse that they are incurring. If we can expose those incoherent foundations, we can then tear down the veil, separating the mechanics of an evil engine at work and the people it ensnares in pursuit of a wider ethic of love and liberation. So yeah, I think the DNA in evangelicalism is fundamentally malformed. But don't take my word for it. We have guests who will come and join me in that conversation, including Jared Stacy, D.L. Mayfield, Christian A. Smith, Mandy Capehart, Liz Grant, Mason Mennenga. The list goes on, but it stops there. My hope is that through each episode, with topics ranging from exposing narcissistic leadership, propaganda, the way evangelicals are suckers for conspiracy theory, how they use patriarchy and ableism to control congregations, how they use white supremacy as a visionary goal, how the Bible's been distorted to fit the opinions of a choice few. All of this coalesce into the present day expression of evangelicalism, and it deserves our interrogation and our questioning as to whether or not it is legitimate, and for you, dear listener, whether or not you should stick around if you're still there. But enough from me. Let's start with some interviews. Let's begin with story. Remember, I noted that we're going to bring experts to speak on the why, but we also want to absorb some stories because often stories, they affirm within ourselves that we're not alone in the things that we're thinking or believing, that we can say, oh, I'm not the weird one here. They're the baddies. Let's start our interviews with stories, and what better way than to invite a friend? Marla Taviano is our first guest, launching off Farewell Evangelicalism. An appropriate start because Marla Taviano writer, publisher. She not only was a successful writer within the heart, and I mean the heart, of white evangelicalism, she was bought in, hook, line, sinker, stay-at-home mom, all of those tropes Marla embodied, and now she has spent half a decade meandering her way out. I think you'll be able to resonate with many components of Marla's story.
Hi, I'm Marla Taviano, and I live and work on Saliguetii and Congaree lands.
Which is where?
Columbia, South Carolina.
Not to start off bringing up old wounds, but you were in the thick of evangelicalism, weren't you?
Yeah, I was deep in it. I was born into it, and I was dead serious about it, and it was my whole entire life. And I am 49 years old right now, so for a solid 3.5 decades, I was deeply entrenched. I would say my big catalyst was in 2012 when Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old Black boy, was shot and killed. And I had just started attending, it had been a couple years, a new church plant. Our pastor friend, who was a Black man, it started this multi-ethnic church. I have new Black friends. And one of my friends says on Facebook, "Why aren't my white friends talking about Trayvon Martin?" I didn't know what she was talking about. I Google it, I find out, and that everything just snowballed from there, where I was completely unaware of all of the Black men and boys who have been gunned down by police. I start reading all these books, learning all these things. But backing up before that, I want to say in around 2009, we were attending a different church at the time, and I was sitting at the pool with my 3 little girls and reading a book called The Hole in Our Gospel by Richard Stearns, I think his name was. He had some world vision or compassion or something that he did in another country. And he's talking about how if the gospel is not good news for this AIDS orphan in Uganda, then something's missing. There's a hole in our gospel. And that shook me out of this idea of the only thing that matters is people's eternal salvation. Like these Democrats over here are talking about feeding people and what have you, but the most important thing is their eternal soul. And then realizing and waking up to, think about the privilege that I had to live with for that long to not realize that Jesus died on the cross for your sins, period. And that's it, is good news for everyone. People who have no home, or they're starving, or they're dying of AIDS, like all of these things. And going to heaven when you die is the best news, the best help that I am willing to give them. So that's what I credit with really starting it. I've been looking back through old journals. I have 62 journals written to God, excuse me, over the course of 20 years. And I recognize that in around 2007 and 8, I was starting to question some of the end times theology that I had always held on to. And that scared me a little bit. So there are a lot of pieces, but the biggest thing was Trayvon Martin in 2012. So by the time Trump came along in 2016, I was deep into it. I had already woken up to a lot of things. So there were 2 times when many of my fellow American Christians were waking up: 2016 with Trump, and then 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. And at that time, I had moved back to the States. I lived in Cambodia from 2015 to March 2020, moved back to the States. And when George Floyd was murdered, I had people reach out to me then who had unfriended me years prior, when I was really gung-ho with all my new information I had about racism and white supremacy. And they had unfriended me and then said, "Okay, I see what you were saying now. Can we be friends again?" And I've had quite a bit of that happen. There are plenty of people who I've not spoken to in many, many years, and they have no desire to ever speak to me again, probably. But yeah, that was my catalyst.
Hmm. When you look back, thanks for sharing that. There's all these different components, and it's cool to hear how, and maybe we don't give enough credence to this, but how when given some options, a lot of folks will stop and interrogate what on earth is going on around them. And I think the Floyd murder was certainly a catalyst, especially for white folks. But it was also something that was easily shoved underneath the rug because COVID still was taking our attention in a bigger way. Not like it's done now, but and people didn't get to the place where there's some features here as I try to think of like, a listener who is kind of on the precipice of figuring out their journey and making sense, slotting in some events to see how things are connected here. Would you credit your willingness to dive deeper into hard things?
Actually, if I was going to point to just one thing, and I'm sure it's more than that, but another catalyst that I didn't really mention was Rachel Held Evans, who was writing at a time, and I probably won't get my dates right. I'm thinking like 2010, 2011. I can't remember when her first book came out. It was called Evolving in Monkeytown. And it has since been changed to Faith Unraveled, probably because the book publishing people were like, yeah, this title isn't great for book sales. Yeah. We're gonna switch this up. What happened with her, she was a lot younger. I can't remember how much younger than me she was, but our paths were so like almost identical. The way that we were so zealous and on fire for Jesus and witnessing to people in our public high schools. And we just knew everything about the Bible, and we had these airtight defenses for anything that anyone would throw at us. So when she comes along and writes this book, and I know that she is on fire for God, just like I am, and she's starting to question things. At first, I was afraid to read her book. And then I had to be honest with myself and ask, why are you afraid? If she's wrong, then keep going on your merry little way of having all the right answers and knowing the truth. And if she's right about some of these things, then you've got some things you need to deal with. So in the past, that's another thing I've been looking back on in these journals and other things that I can remember. Like, Marla, you're smart. How did you fall for all of this stuff in evangelical Christianity? And it's because I believed so strongly that it was right that I used my smartness to just work my way around things and figure out arguments and figure out ways to fill in the gaps and the holes and all of that. That's the way that I used my intelligence. And so when Rachel comes along, and she is just as intelligent as me, probably more so, and just as zealous as me, probably more so, and she is being honest and starting to question things and talking to people who are of different religions, who are gay, all these different things. And so when I started reading her work, that was it. That gave me the permission then to also start questioning things. And it really is a slippery slope. That's the one true thing that they say, is that this is going to lead to a slippery slope out of Christianity if you're not careful. And it really does, because you've got to put all those pieces together. And it's very hard to keep them together if you aren't as committed as I was. And I was super committed. So you've got some people who are super committed to this belief system. You've got other people who are just kind of in it. They don't really care as much. And that's what I found in the deconstruction community, is these are people who were all in. These are people who knew their stuff, who cared very deeply, otherwise, there's just really not a whole lot of reason to deconstruct a faith that you never worked really, 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 really hard to put together. And so that's been my experience, and that's why it's a little bit frustrating. I don't get frustrated anymore about it. I don't really care. But when people say, oh, you just deconstructed so you could sin or have sex, or you want this or you want that. Yeah, no, that's not it. Or you were never saved. And I always say, yeah, tell that to my 62 journals. Who was I talking to in my journals? Who was this God? What were a million Bible studies that I was doing and writing and leading and going to church and volunteering in ministries and being a missionary? Like, I write poetry about deconstruction, and I have poems that I've written to the Apostle Paul because I'm challenging him. He's got this big list of things that he tells you, like, these are all my credentials, all the things I've done, all the places I've been, all my accolades. And I'm like, yeah, you you don't have anything on me, Paul. I've written way more Christian books. I was a Christian clown. We were both Christian missionaries. I was a Christian teacher, a Christian camp counselor, just on and on and on. So to say that I was never saved is laughable, because if I was never saved, then there's no one who was ever saved, because there are very few people who can hold a candle. I mean, my book sales might not be great, other things might not be great, but I was the best Christian.
Thank you, Marla, for sharing your story. It's important for us to bring forward stories, not just facts, because within stories are truths. We see pieces of ourselves. We get language to make sense of our own story. For the women who are listening, when you hear Marla's story, we didn't dive deep into her experience as a stay-at-home mom, but when you're in the clutches of evangelicalism or conservative Christianity as a woman, there are different expectations pressed onto you and your body. We're going to talk about those in a future episode on patriarchy. Let's continue our stories with my friend Mason. Mason, you probably know of if you're on social media. He is the court jester. That's not nice. Sorry, Mason. Mason has used humor to diffuse the toxicity in evangelicalism and call evangelicals to account. It's really easy to do when there's so much fodder out there for us to pick up on. If you've seen a lot of the different memes, especially the VeggieTales ones, chances are Mason is behind them. Here's Mason to share his story on deconstruction and also just little pieces and glimpses of hope on the other end. We're going to end this whole series on hope and liberation, but we tease components of it with Mason's story.
I'm Mason Mennenga, and I host a podcast called A People's Theology, and I also have a YouTube channel that is named Mason Mennenga. It's pretty creative name, I think. I think I had the most prototypical evangelical experience, especially for somebody who grew up in white evangelicalism in particular, and somebody who grew up in the 90s and 2000s. My parents had they had the three kids. I, like you mentioned, grew up knowing all the VeggieTales music. Like, that was the first music I ever knew growing up, was VeggieTales. So I was, instead of all the other like kids music that other kids that I grew up with might have grown up singing or whatever, I just knew VeggieTales songs. Really got into all of that, and then eventually got into a John Piper phase when I was in high school, because I thought I was like this like holier than thou teenage Christian that was like better than all the other Christians, because I like studied theology and studied the Bible, and the gospel was so important to me. And I thought all of these other kids were like watering down the gospel. And I was just like the typical holier than thou Calvinist that seems to really, that whatever that stereotype is, like that person doesn't seem to like grow up for a lot of people, which is really interesting. All the political stuff that came up in evangelicalism too, right? Like my parents were big at the time, were big George W. Bush supporters, and typical conservatives. I still remember when Obama got elected and then the Tea Party became a big thing here in the States, where it was like basically like all these like libertarians that actually weren't libertarian. They were like actually just straight up conservatives that were just mad at the time. I remember getting involved in that whole little like Tea Party movement when I was in, I think, early high school. So yeah, I was like super involved like politically in that way, or at least cared about the politics of conservative evangelicalism. I cared about the theology. I was the kid that I still remember having one of my high school papers where we were learning about evolution. And so instead of like doing my paper on evolution, I did like evolution versus, I think at the time I was an old earth creationist. I don't think I bought into young earth creationism so much, but I just like I did all the things that like all the evangelical kids were supposed to be into. What's that? What was the big youth group conference that went around for a while? Acquire the Fire. I went to Acquire the Fire one year, and then my church, because we were like from South Dakota, we couldn't do the big Acquire the Fire anymore. So we went to like the sort of B version, or the diet version of Acquire the Fire, called Dare to Share. And that's actually where I first found out about this guy named Propaganda. I don't know if you've followed Propaganda at all, but like he's actually super cool now. But that's how I first found out about that guy. So yeah, again, like just you grow up, youth group camps, like just literally everything that you can think of that like the evangelical kid experienced in the 90s and 2000s. I did all those things and was a part of all those things and bought into all those things. All of it. I was into it. So I think I had the most prototypical experience of evangelicalism. And I know I'm not alone. Like I know there's so many other people that were had that exact kind of experience. So yeah, I did all the things and bought into all the things that were conservative evangelicalism in the 90s and 2000s.
Bought into all the things. Does that resonate? Does that sound like your story if you grew up in evangelicalism as a kid? That's the power of stories, because we realized we weren't the only weirdos. I asked Mason to continue sharing, but this time to fast forward a little bit to his deconstruction journey.
Yeah. Yeah. All of that happened very early on, right? Like, so for me, like that whole deconstruction thing, it wasn't as if like I went from, all right, now I'm deconstructing purity culture, and then I'm going to do all of that. And then I'm going to move on to, can you be gay? And then I'm going to move on to hell or whatever. Like all of it happened all at the same time, right? So the purity culture stuff, the sexuality question, the sexism question, the hell question, the atonement theory question, like all of those kind of questions that typically get deconstructed at some point, they all happened at the same time. And so, yeah, I was probably around like my freshman or sophomore year when I started to realize, like, first off, like this whole thing about like women can't be pastors, like biblically doesn't really seem to add up much. And also, like, even if it did, it's still kind of messed up. Like, some of these like professors that I have are women, and they know way more than I do. They seem to be way better leaders than a lot of the men I know. And so why would that just like, why could they not have that kind of leadership if they know more and they're just a better leader in general, just simply because their genital is the wrong genital or whatever, right? Like, or their chromosomes are the wrong chromosomes. And so that seemed to me like that just didn't make any sense anymore. So all of those kind of questions around like the patriarchal kind of system, they just all started to like be revealed to me, where I'm like, oh, this whole thing is messed up. It's connected to the purity culture stuff. It's connected to why a lot of these people think that women can't be pastors. It's connected to all of this. And so it all kind of came crumbling down all at the same time for me. And so, yeah, I started to really recognize like, oh, some of these like ideas that I've had about women, or at least some of the ideas that were kind of pressed on to me, even if I hadn't really maybe like I don't know if I would have been like 18 years old and thought of myself as like, oh yeah, women can't be pastors, or like women are like my servant or whatever. I don't know if I really had that like internalized theology, but certainly it was the kind of theology that was pressed onto me.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized, oh, I need to like actually start to unravel some of those beliefs and start to recognize like, oh, women are really hurt by some of these ideas, some of these theologies. And so that all happened again, probably when I was like 18, 19 years old, something like that. And yeah, again, and it's just all unraveled all at the same time. Maybe towards the end of college, and I was starting to kind of get this sense of like, all right, what am I going to do next in life? Where am I going to go? What am I going to do for a job? All of those kind of questions were starting to come up. And I was also starting to think of like big picture, like what do I want my life to look like in 50 years? Like what do I want to what's the sort of legacy I want to leave in the next like 50 years? Like what do I want to contribute to the world in these next 50 years? So I started asking those kind of questions when I was, I don't know, 21 years old, something like that. And I remember like thinking like every night for a number of nights in a row when I was like a junior in college, Rachel Held Evans had been so important in my life at that moment. And I remember like the kind of things that she would write about are things that I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know that anybody else had that experience. And I didn't realize anybody else had like thought about their faith in this way. Like she was so great at that. She was so, so good at that. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, whatever I'm able to contribute to the world, like I want to at least be what Rachel Held Evans was for me. I want to be like that for somebody else.
Now, Mason's story on deconstruction was a little bit longer and it had different pit stops along the way. I wanted to ask Mason about his experience dealing with theobros. You know the types, those dude bros on the internet who love to hurl violent vitriol against anyone who disagrees with their perspective of the world or faith. Mason, because he uses humor a lot, pokes the bear, and as a result, he receives an inordinate amount of violent rhetoric in his DMs. It's important to expose this side of Christianity, so I asked him how he deals with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, it just all like if you pull back those layers, all of it comes back to different forms of supremacy, whether it's white supremacy or patriarchal supremacy or heterosexual supremacy, whatever it might be. Like there's all these different forms of supremacy that they're trying to protect at all costs, right? Because they have their identities have been the normative identities in the world, and they're doing whatever they can to maintain that privilege and status. And so even if that's not the explicit conversation that's being had, maybe it's not, maybe it could be about like how silly creationism is. At some point, if you peel this back enough, one of those kind of layers of supremacy is going to be revealed, whether it's white supremacy or patriarchal supremacy or heterosexual supremacy, whatever it might be, right? And so, yeah, I think it always comes back to like some form of supremacy that they're trying to maintain.
The thing is, it's not just theobros. We just have to look around to the Exvangelical movement. Shout out to Blake Chastain for coining the Exvangelical hashtag. The explosion of content around the Exvangelical movement, which is mostly white folks coming out of their evangelicalism, has produced a certain type of response that still remains couched within whiteness, in that deconstruction without decolonization tends to reproduce all of the prior harms we're trying to escape in bad or malformed church experiences. I asked Mason about this since, he's in the heart of it all, if he's noticing similar trends. For me, it's pretty white driven because most of the folks are coming out of white evangelicalism.
Yeah.
In America, because that's the largest. And the deconstruction movement is dominated by those voices as well.
Yeah. You're right that when I first started quote unquote deconstructing, we didn't call it like that. I'm sure I don't know if I had a name for it at all.
Yeah,
I just was like, well, my beliefs are changing.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know if I had, there wasn't a name for it or anything. So it was around the time that I started getting more active on Twitter that I started hearing this like term ex-evangelical and deconstruction.
Right, yeah.
And that was also around the time that I started reading Peter Rollins. And so for me, Peter Rollins was just like, deconstruction is like a philosophical term that comes from postmodern, Jacques Derrida, that kind of thing. So for me, like deconstruction meant that. And then people started to use that term as a way to describe like, I don't believe these beliefs anymore that I had grown up with, especially those who grew up in conservative evangelicalism. And so that's kind of what that meant. And it has just like taken on its own like industry essentially, where like you have people who are like deconstruction influencers, where they basically make a full-time income like creating deconstruction content of like, I don't believe thing anymore or whatever, right? And so I was just like, oh wow, like this whole thing that I had just gone through in
Yeah.
college now is
Yeah.
just like becoming an entire industry on social media, it seemed like.
Mhm.
So I thought that was like really interesting. And so it's very different. You know, I know that you also kind of were in like formed by like the emergent church kind of world or whatever. Again, you mentioned like Brian McLaren and stuff. What that world was, I think that world had a very similar experience in the sense that a lot of those people came from white evangelicalism. They sort of quote unquote deconstructed their beliefs or whatever. But primarily that world was a more like church planning world, right? Like a lot of those people that were in the emergent church world were people who grew up in conservative evangelicalism, were like, I'm not that anymore, but I'm still a Christian and I still want to create a church that feels authentic to who I am. That's primarily what it seemed like the emergent church world was. Whereas this deconstruction world is not interested in like planning churches, right? It's just like, we're going to create content that helps you kind of like expose all of this like bullshit of conservative evangelicalism, right? I think you're absolutely right that it primarily is a white movement, mostly because, like you mentioned before, the people who are deconstructing or using that term are people who come from white evangelicalism. Well, surprise, surprise, people who come from white evangelicalism, most of them are white. So I think you're right that like a lot of people coming out of that, that is the sort of demographic of that. But I think, and I'm sure you're kind of wanting to name this, that doesn't have to be, whiteness does not have to be the only category or the only way that we think through deconstruction.
Our conversation around internalized whiteness and whether or not white Christians or those lapsed Christians would even notice their formation of whiteness, that's an important question to ask for listeners who haven't deeply interrogated the ways racialized understandings impact their worldview. Now, let's pivot and end this episode with a component of hope. I will include a full episode around concepts of liberation, of decolonial hope, of ways to move forward in a good way. But I thought I'd tease out a little preview with Mason's thoughts on what hope looks like moving forward. Your thoughts of how to start meandering through a more life-giving way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll first off say that as much as I may be thought of as like a deconstruction influence or whatever, which is fine. I don't care however people want to talk about me, but I think of my work as I'm just trying to share this kind of Christianity that I've learned about and I have been shared, like has been shared to me.
It's yours.
And I want to share that with others, right? Like I think of myself as sort of like an evangelist in that way. I just want to share this amazing gospel of Jesus coming to, God becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus and Jesus doing this amazing, loving and liberating ministry. And eventually, obviously, he was killed by these imperial powers and then he rises again and then ascends, and it's like, oh my God, like the end of the story isn't this guy being killed by the imperial powers. Like there's new life after that. I'm like, that to me, that's a story I want to live into. And I want to figure out what are ways that I can live into that story today.
Amen.
In my life.
Amen.
And I want to share that same exact story to other people and think about all the different fun, great, wonderful, powerful, liberating theologies out there that gets us to that story and maybe help try to figure out in our own lives, what does that look like for me today on April 29th, 2024? What does it look like for Mason Mennenga to participate in this liberating gospel of Jesus? I know that there's hope for other people who sort of deconstruct from Christianity and hopefully start to decolonize their, not only just their theology that they've inherited, but also to deconstruct and decolonize all the kind of ways that they think about the world, they understand the world. And I think there's really great hope in potentially, you know what? There's another way that we can live in the world.
The hope is also rooted in the present in that we see the good things and the communities on the margins who are resisting and demonstrating a radical joy. Like these things are happening in this moment right here, right now.
Exactly.
And we can join the thing that is happening in the here and the now unto a more liberative way, starting with the margins first. And see that. Yeah. And unrolling with what is to come.
Yeah. I still remember, I live in Minneapolis, and in 2020, in May of 2020, George Floyd was murdered probably a couple miles from where I lived. And what happened in the aftermath of that was seeing a community come together and say, never again. We will never let this happen to somebody in our community ever again. And to see people come together in the midst of the chaos that was happening in Minneapolis at the time, to see people to come together and say, what do you need right now? Do you need diapers? Do you need a prayer? What do you need right now? And to see people come together and recognize we don't need all of these systems like the police or whatever it might be. We don't need these sort of systems to keep us safe and to provide for our needs. We have each other, and each other is enough for this world. And that to me gave me so much hope. I'm like, whatever I've heard about as like the sort of like kingdom of God or kingdom of God, I'm like, that's being lived out right now amongst these neighbors in Minneapolis, loving each other, caring for each other, making sure everybody's needs are met. And to me, I'm like, that is the good work that I want to be a part of. I happen to think that the story of Jesus is what animates me to do that in the world. And that might not be the case for other people. There's other sort of stories that other people are animated by. But I'm like, that's, to me, the way I think about it is what was happening in Minneapolis at the time was the kingdom of God coming here on earth, where people loved each other, cared for each other, provided for each other, and made sure that they were all safe and all their needs were met. I think back to this all the time. Reverend Lenny Duncan, who's been on my podcast a number of times. I don't know if you know Lenny Duncan at all.
Yeah.
But Lenny one time said, if we truly loved our neighbors as ourselves, if we truly loved our neighbors the way that Jesus taught us to love our neighbors, if we truly did, we would never need the police ever again. Because if you truly love the neighbor down the street that might be having some sort of breakdown in their mental health, and you truly knew that person well enough to know this is what this person needs right now, you would never need to call a cop.
Yeah.
Right? And so to me, I'm like, what can I do to live into this message of loving our neighbors that Jesus taught us? And if that's the case, what are ways then that if I actually love my neighbor the way that Jesus taught, maybe I'm actually participating in dismantling some of these systems that actually keep me from loving my neighbor.
Thank you, Mason. Thank you, Marla. They have launched us off into episode 1 and this serial season called Farewell Evangelicalism. Stories are important because within these stories, we see pieces of ourselves. And it's really curious to me how evangelicals as a whole, regardless of where you are across the continent and maybe the world, you share similarities. Because there's so many pieces, whether it's monuments, books, beliefs, systems, they all are the same. We all laugh at the same VeggieTales jokes. I think there's a design behind that we need to pay attention to. By the way, Marla's interview was recorded around the inauguration of 2025. Mason's interview was recorded at the end of April 2024. Most of the interviews in Farewell Evangelicalism were recorded in the last half of 2024. That's important because the election happened in November, and that might have changed some of their inputs and their responses. I don't think anyone's response would have changed, but it certainly would have gotten a lot stronger with language of resistance and justice. Episode 2 on Farewell Evangelicalism will ask the question of how. How is it that evangelicals across the continent wound up believing in the same things? Well, to figure out the how, we need to get a bigger picture of the cultural context that evangelicalism has operated in. We need to start pinpointing when the beliefs flew off the rails and how a massive group of people numbering into the millions were shaped and maybe tricked. Thank you for listening to a Faith in a Fresh Vibe podcast. Tell all your friends.